Okay guys, welcome to Offerspill's coverage of the Norway chess classical tournament in Stavanger. I'm gonna cover Magnus's second game today, his classical game against Alireza Firouzja. And of course this game ended in a draw, so they did play a tiebreaker as well. We'll take a look at that in the next video. In this game, Magnus with the white pieces chose to opt for 1d4. Magnus can of course play a lot of different openings. Alireza does that as well. He's got a very flexible opening repertoire, but he chose the Queen's Gambit in this game. He started though with knight f6, c4 for Magnus, and then e6, knight c3. Of course you could go for something else here. You could go for the Benoni, c5. This is of course quite risky and not so popular at the top level. You could go for the classical Nimzo Indian with bishop b4. This is something we'll look at some later stage on our YouTube channel, but Alireza chose the classical Queen's Gambit move d5. Of course, this is also quite logical, taking a stake in the center. Magnus has a lot of options here, and he's played a lot of different moves over the years in this position. He's played knight f3, bishop f4, maybe even bishop g5, but he did take on d5 immediately. Big decision here for black. Of course, Alireza chose the relatively more complex option e d5. You could go for the semi-Tarrasch knight d5 move. This move is quite solid, and you want to trade pieces with black. Your position is slightly cramped, and you want to, after e4, take on c3 and play c5 again to exchange some more pieces via this operation. First trading in the center, and then bishop b4, forcing bishop d2, taking on d2, and then castling. And okay, black has a very nice development, very easy play with maybe b6, bishop b7, get the knight out and start to pressure the white center. On the other hand, white's development is also quite easy because you have traded a lot of pieces. There's only the bishop left to develop. Often that goes to c4 and you castle with white. And of course you have a big center, two very nice center pawns, but again, black's position is not so difficult to handle, at least not immediately. But this is a completely different style of play, and probably not to Alireza's taste. He went for the classical ed5. Bishop g5, pinning the knight, c6, defending the pawn on d5, and then e3. Probably planning some development with the bishop d3. h6. Of course, you don't want to give up your bishop too easily by taking on f6. That would free up black's position a bit, and suddenly black's pair of bishops could get quite uncomfortable for white on the king side. So we instead we play bishop h4 as Magnus did in this game. Bishop e7, trying to break the pin. Bishop d3 and castles from Alireza. No big surprise there. And now big decision for Magnus where to put the knight. Could go to f3, could go to e2. You don't want to go to h3. Knight on the rim is dim, as we say. It's not so flexible and not so helpful on h3. And Magnus went for knight e2. This move is connected with the f3 e4 plan, as we see Magnus opts for in this game. If you go to f3, then very often your long-term plan is quite positional. With white here, you want to play for the minority attack with rook b1 and b4, b5 to attack the root of black's pawn structure on the queen side. Knight e2 played, rook e8, and then castles from Magnus. Very natural move. Again, the natural move from black was knight b d7, just trying to finish development and maybe even try to reroute the knight. f3 from Magnus. Of course, this is a very committal move. Of course, you want to play e4 and claim the center as your own, but at the same time, we see that the e3 pawn could get quite weak if you're not careful. For example, if the dark squared bishops suddenly get exchanged off, this square on e3 could get quite weak for white. So this is a very committal plan. It's, well, in lack of better wording, you could say it's high risk, high reward. but again, it's a plan you would need to know in advance before going for it, as the e3 pawn might get weak. And the rook b1, b4, b5 plan is probably more solid and safe for white, but again, the rewards are not as high as the e4 plan, which just attempts to roll over black in the center immediately. Alireza doesn't hang about. He plays b5, goes for some counterplay on the queen side immediately. You could wonder if this pawn on c6 might get too weak. This bishop will pop up on b7 to protect it, and maybe even c5 will be played at some point. Of course, if black gets stuck with some concession or weakness in the center, as the d5 pawn might become after playing the break c5, then that's not too much of a worry, because black wants to pressure the e3 pawn in return. Bishop f2. Wise decision from Magnus, just keeping an eye out on e3. Bishop b7 as proclaimed. Knight g3, trying to get to f5. And then b4, knight a4, and c5 from Alireza. Very nice play from him. Trying to break in the center before Magnus is able to stabilize his position. Instead of taking here, Magnus goes for a knight f5. And you might wonder why not c4 from Alireza here. Well, first of all, you would have to count on Magnus taking the bishop on e7, and if you recapture, then maybe just bishop c2. And even though the knight is a bit stuck on a4, the e3 pawn is well protected, and you could plan a long-term break with e4. And again, white has the two bishops. Instead of this, Alireza chose to retreat with bishop f8. And now an exchange operation from Magnus, trying to liberate his knight, or at least exchange it off. Rook c1, queen b6, very nice move, protecting and pressurizing e3. Queen a4 from Magnus, chasing the knight away. Bishop d7, chasing the queen away in return. And queen a6, going for the trade of queens, as Magnus wants to relieve himself of some pressure against the e3 pawn. An exchange of queens would suit him perfectly in this position. Some more natural moves from the players, and now suddenly we see that the game has started to center around the d4 square and the e3 square. Magnus is not able to pressurize the d5 pawn as much as he might have liked yet. Knight e8 from Alireza, trying to go to c7, maybe even d6. Magnus exchanges queens. Alireza takes back with the pawn. You might wonder why, but he stabilizes his bishop on c5 and opens up for the rook to attack the a2 pawn. Bishop b1, a necessity from Magnus to protect himself. Bishop a4, just trying to lure from Magnus to play b3, which might be weakening. We see the two squares on a3 and c3 might be a bit vulnerable suddenly. Bishop d7, just retreating. Knight e2, knight c7, again protecting this d5 pawn, and now we see some maneuvering play from the players, trying to get the better of their opponent by pressurizing d5 and protecting it. And now suddenly a very nice and strategic move from Magnus, g4, trying to claim the king side. Maybe even play h4 at some later point to get some space. Knight e6, knight f5. Of course, if you want to gain space and attack, you don't want to exchange pieces, so Magnus keeps his knight. Rook c7, and now h4. There's no need to be worried about your own king and king side safety here, as there's no black pieces to attack the king. So using your pawns, usually preserved as a shield for your king to attack now, is just logical and very nicely done by Magnus. However, Alireza is pretty solid in this position and doesn't need to do anything fancy to keep his chances alive. Rook a c8, just doubling rooks. Magnus does the same against the d5 pawn. However, this is pretty well protected still by the bishop on b7. And we see now another advantage of forcing Magnus to play b3 earlier. There's no bishop c2, bishop b3 maneuver for white to pressurize the d5 pawn. And as a result, black's position with the pawn on d5 is still quite solid. Bishop f8 from Alireza. Bishop g3 from Magnus. Trying to pressure the rook on c7, force that somewhere. He goes to c3. And we see Magnus trying to maneuver his pieces out, trying to improve his pieces, but Alireza breaks with d4, and suddenly it's apparent that there's no big advantage for white in this position. However, he chooses e4. Of course, you don't want to exchange here, as it might free up black's position even more. Suddenly we see the two bishops and the rooks on the open file, very powerful, and white might even come under some slight pressure, so you don't want to do that. You want to close the position off, e4, rook a8, and now bishop c4. Looks pretty convincing this for white, but now a nice trick from Alireza, rook c2. Of course, if Magnus takes, then d3 is a very huge problem for white. This is not what you want with the white pieces. Suddenly a pawn down, and this pawn is super powerful as well. Magnus goes for bishop d3. Rook takes a2, and suddenly black is up a pawn. However, there's some pressure against the d4 pawn, so Magnus is not super concerned, I believe, in this position. An exchange of rooks, rook a5, king g3, and Magnus could, at his own convenience, take this pawn off the board. Just move the bishop from d3 maybe to c4, and then the pressure on the d4 pawn would be too much to handle for black. Bishop a6 played, and then the game peters out to a draw, as this was primarily an exchange operation from Alireza. Bishop d4, rook a3, still trying to add some pressure, and then rook d3, some exchanges, a check, h5, closing in the king. There's no rush here, as the rook will be able to collect the black b pawn. Rook a3, rook d4, and now Alireza decides enough is enough. A draw is fine by me. Couple of exchanges, and we arrive at a dead equal rook endgame. 3 pawns and a rook each, and the players agree to a draw. A very nice performance by Alireza, very solid stuff against the world champion. And in the next video we'll take a look at the playoff game, the tiebreaker between the two players.